The envelope was still on my kitchen table when I got home from my walk, right where my son had left it 3 days earlier. I hadn't touched it. I'd walked past it every morning on my way to make coffee, every evening on my way to bed, and I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just paper, that a man my age shouldn't let a birthday card from his own child sit unopened for 3 days and feel nothing but tired. I finally picked it up on a Thursday morning. Inside was a gas station scratch ticket, the kind that costs $2, and a card with a cartoon dog on the front saying, "Hope your day is possum." My son was 41 years old. I set it down carefully. I set it down the way you set something down when you're trying not to throw it. Let me back up a little, because that moment doesn't mean much without the weeks that came before it. I turned 64 that October. I'd been retired for 8 months after 31 years working as a site supervisor for a construction company out of London, Ontario. Good work, honest work. The kind that leaves you with bad knees and a decent pension and hands that never quite get clean. My wife, Irene, had passed 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself, just arrives. After she was gone, I sold our house in Byron and moved to a smaller place in Port Stanley, about 40 minutes south, right on Lake Erie. I needed to be near the water. I don't know how to explain that better than that. My son, I'll call him my son throughout this, lives in Oakville with his wife and their 2 kids. We'd always been close, or I thought we were close. The kind of close where you don't talk every day. But when you do, it's easy. After Irene died, he came down for the funeral, stayed 4 days, helped me go through some of her things. I was grateful. I thought we'd turned a corner somehow, gotten more honest with each other in the way grief sometimes forces. His wife I'll be kind about. She comes from money. Her father owned car dealerships in the GTA, and she has always had a particular way of looking at things that belong to other people. Like she's calculating. I noticed it years ago and chose to ignore it, the way you ignore a slow drip until the ceiling comes through. The trouble started in the spring, about 5 months before my birthday. My son called me on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual. He normally texted. He sounded relaxed, almost too relaxed, the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. He said his wife had found a property in Muskoka. A cottage. Not huge, he said, but right on the water, a good bones, motivated seller. The asking price was just under $800,000, but they thought they could get it for $750,000. They'd already spoken to their bank. I said that sounded like a lot of cottage. He laughed and said, yeah, it wasn't cheap. Then he paused and I could hear his wife in the background, not her words, just her presence, and he said the thing I'd been, in some quiet part of myself, waiting for. He said they were a little short, just the down payment. They had $150,000 saved, but the bank wanted $250,000 more. And he said, and I remember this exactly, he said, "Dad, you've got it sitting there. You're not doing anything with it." I want to be clear about something. He wasn't entirely wrong that I had savings. After I sold the Byron house and bought the smaller place in Port Stanley, I had about $230,000 in a savings account at TD. I've been thinking about putting some of it into GICs, maybe helping with my grandchildren's rests. I hadn't spent it because Irene and I had always been careful people, and being careful had started to feel like the only part of her I could still carry. I told him I'd think about it. I should not have said that. Saying, "I'll think about it," to someone who has already decided you're going to say yes is not a kindness. It's just a delay. Over the next 6 weeks, my son called more than he had in the previous 2 years combined. His wife emailed me a link to the cottage listing. She emailed me photos. She called once herself, which she had never done before, and spent 20 minutes explaining the Muskoka real estate market to me like I was someone who needed educating. She mentioned, twice, that property values there had gone up 40% over the past decade. She mentioned that the grandchildren would have somewhere to spend their summers. She said, Our family a lot. Our family this. Our family that. I noticed she never said, your money. I didn't transfer the 50,000. I told my son in July that I wasn't comfortable lending that amount, that I was 63 and on a fixed income, and I needed to keep what I had accessible. He went quiet in a way that felt like a door closing. He said he understood. I don't think he understood. They bought the cottage anyway. I found out later. His wife's parents gave them the difference. My birthday is October 14th. Thanksgiving weekend, usually, which meant we sometimes combined it with the family dinner. That year, my son and his wife were hosting. They'd invited her parents, two of her siblings and their families, and me. I drove up on the Saturday, 2.5 hours on the 401, and brought 2 bottles of Niagara Pinot Noir and a pie from a bakery in St. Thomas that Irene had always loved. The dinner was fine on the surface. His in-laws are the kind of people who know how to fill a room. Her father spent most of the meal talking about his properties in Collingwood and Arizona. Her mother asked me twice if I was still in Port Stanley, each time with a small smile I didn't know how to read. The birthday part came after dessert. My son's wife had organized it. She brought out a small cake. They sang. And then my son handed me a card and an envelope. His in-laws got a different envelope that evening, though I didn't know that until later. My son, during the after-dinner conversation, mentioned casually that he and his wife had arranged a river cruise for her parents. Rhine River, 15 nights, departing out of Basel in the spring. He said it like you'd mention the weather. Her father made a noise of pleased surprise. Her mother clapped her hands. $14,000, give or take, for a river cruise through Germany and Austria, because they'd come through with the down payment. And I had a gas station scratch ticket and a cartoon dog. I'm not telling you I cried. I didn't. Not there. I'm 64 years old, and I've buried a wife, and I've done hard work my whole life, and I know how to keep my face still. But I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt since I was a child. Something close to shame. Not my shame. Theirs. But I was the one feeling it. I drove home the next morning. I thanked them for dinner. I kept my voice even. The scratch ticket sat on my kitchen table. I almost threw it out the first day. I held it over the recycling bin and then set it back down. I'm not sure why. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe some small defiant part of me that wanted to make it mean something. I scratched it on Thursday morning, the 5th day, with a coin from the bowl by my front door. A loonie Irene had kept there for years because she said you should always have $1 near the door for luck. I don't know how to explain what it's like to scratch a lottery ticket and watch the numbers come up. I've bought maybe 20 tickets in my life and won nothing more than a free play. I scratched the first row and the numbers didn't match. I scratched the second row, then the third, and then I sat down. It was a $100,000 instant win ticket from the OLG second prize, $100,000. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Long enough that the coffee went cold. I kept thinking Irene would walk in from the garden, the way I still think that sometimes, and I'd be able to tell her. She would have laughed. She laughed at everything that surprised her. I called OLG the next morning and confirmed the process. I'd need to go in person to the prize center in Toronto to claim anything over $10,000. I made the appointment for 2 weeks out. I didn't tell anyone. I want to be honest. Part of me wanted to call my son immediately. There is something in fathers, I think, that never stops wanting to share good news with their children. I picked up my phone twice. Both times I set it back down. I thought about the Rhine River cruise. I thought about the way his wife had said our family while explaining why they needed my savings. I thought about the cartoon dog. I drove to Toronto on a Tuesday, claimed the prize, and took the certified check. After the OLG's standard withholding documentation, Canada doesn't tax lottery winnings directly, but there's still paperwork. I walked out with $100,000. Real money. more than I'd earned in 3 years at the end of my career. I didn't go back to Port Stanley right away. I drove to a diner near Bloor and Dufferin, the kind of place with laminate tables and real coffee. And I ate a grilled cheese sandwich, and I thought about my life for an hour. Then I called my neighbor Don, who is 70 and a retired accountant, and I told him everything: the birthday dinner, the cruise, the scratch ticket, all of it. Don was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" Just that. Not "you should" or "you have to." Just "what do you want?" That question cracked something open. What I wanted, I realized, was simple. I wanted to live without waiting for the next ask. I wanted to stop measuring my son's calls against whether he needed something. I wanted to plant the garden I'd been putting off, the one Irene had always wanted along the south fence with lavender and climbing roses. I wanted to take the train trip through the Rockies that she and I had talked about since our honeymoon, a trip we'd always said someday about, and someday had stopped coming. My son called in November. I've been waiting, not anxiously, just waiting the way you wait for weather you've already predicted. He said he'd heard from a cousin of mine. I have a cousin in London who sometimes knows my business, that I'd won something on a scratch ticket. He was friendly about it, easy-toned, the way he'd been in the spring when he'd first asked about the down payment. I said yes, I'd had some luck. He asked how much. I told him. There was a pause. Then he said that was incredible, that he was so happy for me. He said the kids would love to see me for Christmas, that we should plan something. He said, very naturally, very smoothly, that he and his wife had been talking and they realized that the cottage had stretched them financially, that the mortgage payments were higher than they'd expected with the variable rate increases, and that it would mean a lot if... I said his name, just his name, and he stopped. I told him I loved him. I want to be clear that that part is true, and it was the truest thing I said in that conversation. I told him I had thought carefully about the birthday dinner, about the scratch ticket, about the cruise his in-laws received for the same occasion, where I received a $2 card. I told him I didn't say any of this with anger. I said it the way you'd read something aloud from a page, something that needs to be said clearly once, so there's no confusion later. I told him I would not be helping with the cottage. He said that wasn't fair, that I was punishing him over a card, that his wife had been the one to organize the gifts and he hadn't even known what was in the envelope. That last part might even have been true. I thought about it and decided it didn't change anything, because a man who doesn't know what gift his father receives on his father's birthday has already told you something. His wife called me that evening. She was not friendly this time. She said I had always held her at a distance, that I'd never accepted her into the family, that this was about the cottage and my refusing to help in the spring. She said, and this is the part I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said the money I'd won was good luck that had come to our family and should benefit everyone. I asked her, quietly, whose name was on the lottery ticket. She didn't answer that. I told her I wished her and my son well, and I meant that too, and I ended the call. She posted something on Facebook a few days later. I don't use Facebook much, but my cousin saw it and called me. It was vague enough to have deniability, something about how painful it is when family chooses money over relationships, with a quote about parents and disappointment. Several of her friends commented. My cousin said some of my son's friends had seen it too. I didn't respond. I've learned at 64 that the most powerful thing you can say in public is nothing. What I did instead was contact a lawyer, a good one, a woman in London who'd been recommended to me by Don, and I made some decisions. I updated my will, which needed doing anyway. I set up a formal trust for my grandchildren's education, administered independently, so that whatever happens between me and my son, those kids will have their tuition covered. I did it through the lawyer, so it was arm's length and documented. My son can't touch it and he can't direct it. One day his children will turn 18 and they'll have money waiting for them, and it won't have cost my son anything. And I think that is exactly the right thing. The train trip I took in February, The Canadian, Toronto to Vancouver, 3 nights on the train, through the Shield and the prairies, and then the mountains coming up outside Kamloops. I had a private roomette. I brought 3 books and barely opened them. I ate in the dining car and talked to strangers and watched the country go past and thought about Irene so much it felt like she was on the train too, sitting across from me, laughing at the elk standing in the snow outside Jasper. I cried somewhere west of Edmonton early morning, when the light came up pink over flat land, and I was the only person in the observation car. But it wasn't the bad kind of crying, it was more like putting something down, a weight I hadn't named, carried for years. Finally sat on the floor of a moving train somewhere in Alberta. My son and I have spoken twice since November. Short calls, careful, like 2 people feeling for solid ground. He didn't apologize exactly, but in the second call he said he thought he'd handled things badly in the fall. I said, I thought so too. We agreed to try again slowly. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm not sure he does either. His wife and I have not spoken. Dawn came over for dinner last week. We grilled pickerel on the back deck and drank the second bottle of Niagara Pinot I brought to that birthday dinner and never opened. The one I'd quietly taken back to the car that morning before I drove home. We sat out until it got dark and cold and the lake went black and flat. He asked me how I was doing. I thought about it. Really thought about it. The way you do when someone asks and actually wants to know. I told him I was all right. That some mornings I walk down to the lake before I make coffee, and I stand at the water for a few minutes and just watch the light. That Irene used to do that, and now I do it. And it helps. That the lavender along the south fence came in better than I expected last summer. The whole yard smelling of it when the wind came off the water. That I'd booked a trip to Cape Breton for the fall. The Cabot Trail. Because I'd always said someday about that too, and I'd gotten careful about some days. Don nodded and poured more wine. You know what your mistake was, he said, and I braced a little. You should have scratched that ticket on day 1. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in a while. The kind that starts somewhere deeper than your chest. He was right, of course. $2 from a gas station tossed by a son who thought he already knew what his father was worth. It turns out he didn't know me as well as he thought. I've been sitting with this story for a few months now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, not looking for anything, just feeling the weight of it. What strikes me most isn't the money. $100,000 is real and it changed things for me practically. But that's not what I find myself thinking about when I walk down to the lake in the mornings. What I think about is the loonie. Irene's loonie sitting in the bowl by the front door for years because she believed you should always have $1 near the door for luck. I used that coin to scratch the ticket. I don't think that's a coincidence exactly, but I also don't think it's magic. I think it's just life being stranger and more precise than we give it credit for. There's something about how we treat people that has a way of coming back around. Not as punishment, not as reward from some scorekeeper in the sky, just as consequence. My son's wife calculated what I was worth and made a decision based on that calculation. A $2 ticket for the man who didn't give them the $50,000. A $14,000 cruise for the people who did. Clean math. And then the math stopped being clean. I've thought about what I could have done differently, and I think the honest answer is that I should have been clearer earlier. Not harder, not colder. Clearer. There's a difference. When my son called in the spring and said I had money sitting there, like it was waiting to be claimed, I should have said then, directly, that money I saved over 30 years of hard work is mine to decide about, and that my deciding not to give it isn't a failure of love. I said, I'll think about it, because I was trying to be kind, and being vague isn't kindness, it's just postponed honesty. I've learned that one late, but I've learned it. What I want for my son, and I mean this, is for him to develop the kind of judgment that doesn't need to be corrected by circumstance. That's not something I can give him. Lord knows I tried. The way all fathers try. And somewhere along the way, the trying wasn't enough, or wasn't right, or he just grew into someone I don't fully recognize yet. But judgment, real judgment, the kind that asks, is this right? Before it asks, can I get away with it? That has to come from inside a person. Nobody scratches it out of them. They either build it or they don't. Don asked me once what I thought the whole thing had cost me. I said, more than 100,000. He nodded. Then he said, and what did it give you? I had to think about that longer. I think what it gave me was a kind of clarity. I'd been soft-pedaling for years, about what I owe people and what I don't, about the difference between being generous and being taken for granted, about the fact that my life, the one I have left, however many years that is, belongs to me, and I'm allowed to live it on my own terms without apologizing. The lavender came in beautifully this summer. The train through the Rockies was everything Irene and I had talked about. The Cape Breton trip is booked for October. Some people look at a $2 scratch ticket and see nothing worth keeping. I scratched it anyway, and I'm glad I did. Not because of what it paid out, though that helped, but because of what it reminded me, that you don't get to decide what something is worth before you've looked at it carefully. And sometimes the thing someone dismissed is exactly the thing that changes everything.